How the narcissistic Betty Hutton used men as props to conquer Hollywood. The wrong way to remember her. In 1952, Variety magazine, the publication that has tracked the business of American entertainment since 1905, released its annual ranking of box office performers. At the very top of the list, above every actress working in Hollywood at that moment, was a single name: Betty Hutton. Not a surprise to anyone paying attention, because by 1952, Betty Hutton had been unstoppable for nearly a decade. 14 films at Paramount Pictures, a recording contract with Capitol Records as one of their founding artists, a Broadway career that had packed houses before Hollywood ever came calling. She had shared the screen with Fred Astaire, Bob Hope, Charlton Heston, and Howard Keel. She had stepped into a role that Judy Garland had been fired from, Annie, Get Your Gun, and made it so completely her own that most people today don't know it was ever anyone else's. Photoplay magazine readers voted her Best Actress of 1950. Variety named her the #1 female draw of 1952. At her peak, she was earning more per week than almost any actress Paramount had ever signed. The columnists had names for her: the Blonde Blitz, America's #1 jitterbug, a national treasure, a force of nature. And here's the question nobody was asking at the time, the question that, looking back, explains everything. How exactly did a girl from a speakeasy in Battle Creek, Michigan, with no connections, no family money, and no industry access, climb to the absolute top of the most competitive entertainment system in the world? The answer is not talent. Talent was part of it, but talent alone has never been enough in Hollywood. Talent is the entry fee. The answer is that Betty Hutton had a system, a method she had developed before she was old enough to name it, a way of identifying exactly what she needed and exactly which man was positioned to give it to her. 4 husbands, 4 careers she moved through like rooms in a house, taking what she needed and closing the door behind her. And when the last door closed, when there were no more rooms left and no more men left to open them, what happened to Betty Hutton was something so complete, so total, that the woman who had once been the most commercially powerful actress on the planet ended up washing dishes in a church rectory in Rhode Island, under a name nobody recognized. This is that story, and the part that will stay with you, the part nobody tells, is not the fall, it is the mechanism. The precise, repeating pattern that took her all the way to the top, and then, with the same efficiency, took everything away. Battle Creek. Elizabeth June Thornburg was born in the winter of 1921 in Battle Creek, Michigan. Her father was a barber. Her mother, Mabel, was holding a household together with almost nothing. When Elizabeth was 2 years old, her father left. No dramatic exit, no final argument anyone would later describe. He simply stopped coming home. And the particular silence of that absence, a man-shaped hole in the middle of an ordinary household, settled into the walls and stayed there, permanently. Mabel Thornburg could not afford to grieve. She had 2 daughters to feed. She made a decision that would define both of their childhoods. She opened an illegal drinking establishment during Prohibition, a speakeasy in Battle Creek. Dark rooms, paying customers, and her daughters performing for whoever walked through the door. Elizabeth was not singing because she loved music. She was singing because the rent was due. She would say this herself decades later. In a 1977 interview, she looked directly at the camera and said, "I thought if I became a star and got us out of poverty, she would quit drinking. I didn't know alcoholism was a disease. Nobody did then." There is something in that sentence that is easy to miss if you're listening only to the surface of it. She didn't say she performed because she felt called to it. She said she performed as a transaction, a calculated exchange. If I give people what they want to see, they will give me what I need to survive. She was 5 years old when she first understood that equation. She never unlearned it. By 13, she was performing with Vincent Lopez's orchestra, earning $65 a week at the tail end of the Depression. By 18, she was on Broadway. And by the time Paramount Pictures signed her in 1941, Elizabeth June Thornburg had effectively ceased to exist as a legal identity or a public presence. The studio gave her a new name, Betty Hutton. It sounds like an impact, like something hitting a surface hard and fast. That was entirely the point. How to use a man. What followed was 11 years that still astonish people who study that period of American film. 14 features at Paramount, roles opposite Fred Astaire, Howard Keel, Charlton Heston, Bob Hope. A recording contract with Capitol Records, one of the first major artists to sign with the label. A touring schedule that would have broken most performers in half. But the career itself is only one half of the story, and it is the less interesting half. What is worth examining is the pattern running directly underneath it, because from the very first days of her rise, Betty Hutton positioned herself next to men who could be useful. And the moment they were no longer useful, she moved on. Not out of cruelty, out of something that was almost structural. The same instincts that had kept her alive in that speakeasy in Battle Creek. Identify the resource, secure it, move before it disappears. The first man who mattered was Buddy DeSilva, songwriter, producer, and the executive who took control of Paramount Pictures in 1941 and gave Betty her first real film role in The Fleet's Inn. He believed in her the way that studio executives almost never believe in anyone, as a force, not merely a face. Under his sponsorship, she got roles. She got visibility. She got the platform she needed to be seen by enough people to matter. When DeSilva's health deteriorated and he was forced to step away from Paramount, Betty did not slow down. She accelerated. The same year brought Panama Hattie on Broadway, where she shared a stage with Ethel Merman, the most powerful theatrical presence in the country at that moment. Betty was so consistently the person audiences were watching that Merman went to the producers and had her songs cut, her stage time reduced, her visibility managed. Betty did not fight back. She made a note. If someone can take something from you this easily, you have not yet made yourself unreachable. She filed that lesson away and kept moving. By 1945, at the crest of her early fame, she married Ted Briskin, heir to a camera manufacturing fortune, entirely outside the entertainment industry. Friends described him as patient, steady, devoted. The marriage would last 7 years. People who knew the household said Betty's attention lived somewhere else almost entirely. That Ted existed, in practical terms, in the background of a life that was happening at full speed somewhere beyond him. He was stable ground. She used it to keep running. Then came 1950, and Annie Get Your Gun. The role had been built for Judy Garland. MGM had her under contract, had started filming with her, and then, under the accumulated pressure of her personal difficulties, removed her from the production. The part went to Betty. She walked into a film another woman had already half inhabited, and she remade it so completely that most people today have never heard that it was ever anyone else's story. Howard Keel, her co-star, later described her in plain language: impetuous and demanding. He said it the way you state a fact about the weather, not with malice, with the flat certainty of a man describing something he had personally witnessed and was no longer surprised by. And yet the film Betty delivered in that role remains one of the most energetically precise pieces of work in American musical cinema. Variety named her the top female box office draw of 1952. Photoplay readers voted her Best Actress of 1950. She was standing at the highest point she would ever reach, and that was the exact moment the 2-year-old girl in the Battle Creek saloon made the most expensive decision of her adult life. The most expensive decision in Paramount history. His name was Charles O'Curran. He was a choreographer, technically precise, professionally respected, the kind of craftsman who could take a performer and make her movement look entirely effortless. They met on the set of Somebody Loves Me in 1952. The attraction moved fast. Within weeks, they had eloped to Las Vegas. The next morning, Betty called Paramount. Her demand was specific. Charles O'Curran was to be named director of her next film, Topsy and Eva. The studio had not assessed him as a director. The studio had their own choices in mind. The studio said no. Betty Hutton, under one of the most productive and profitable contracts in Paramount's institutional history, a woman who had spent 11 years generating an extraordinary return on the studio's investment, terminated the contract herself. She walked out. She did not negotiate. She did not wait. The industry went quiet in a way that people who worked inside it at the time still remember. It looked from the outside like a declaration, a star refusing to be owned, a woman standing up for the man she loved against the machinery of a system that treated people like interchangeable assets.
But examine the shape of the demand itself, and something different appears.
Betty did not lobby for Charles O'Curran because she had seen his work as a director and believed in it. He had not directed a film. She demanded his appointment because directing her film would have made him professionally dependent on her, creatively indebted to her, unable to move forward in that role without her continued approval. It would have placed him, in the most structurally complete sense, inside her orbit. Hers to position, hers to keep. When Paramount refused to construct that arrangement, she didn't simply leave the studio. She removed the very thing that would have made the arrangement possible. The project she and Charles built independently, a Western musical called Satins and Spurs, produced in 1954, failed completely. Not quietly. It failed the way the industry remembers, publicly, totally, with no one willing to say they had not seen it coming. In the months that followed, Betty began offering the press a different account of what had happened. The failure, she implied, had something to do with Charles, his decisions, his approach. The implication was never stated as a direct accusation. It was always just present, threaded through interviews, available for anyone who wanted to reach for it. Charles O'Curran's professional reputation did not recover. The name that had appeared on respected productions disappeared from that level of work. He had entered Betty Hutton's world as a talented craftsman with a growing career. He left it, carrying the weight of a narrative he had not written. They divorced in 1955. She moved on. She always moved on.
The spiral.
The pattern repeated itself twice more, each time with less leverage behind it, each time with a smaller audience watching, each time costing more than the one before. Alan Livingston, her third husband, was a record industry executive at Capitol Records. He had infrastructure, connections, access to a different industry she might still be able to move through. She married him in 1955. She attempted a television series called Goldie. It did not find its audience. The medium required a kind of sustained, intimate presence that was different from the explosive energy she had built her career on. And she had never developed it, because she had never needed to. The marriage lasted 5 years. Pete Candoli was the fourth, a jazz trumpet player. No film connections, no industry leverage, no career she could redirect or benefit from professionally. For the first time in her adult life, Betty Hutton had married a man she could not use. And for the first time, she had nothing left to use him with anyway. Here is the part of the story that has nothing to do with Hollywood, and everything to do with the way human beings sometimes organize their lives around avoiding themselves. Most of us have done a version of this, not at this scale, not with these consequences, but the basic movement is familiar, reaching toward a relationship not because of what we can give, but because of what it lets us avoid feeling. Using proximity to another person as a way of staying in motion, staying busy, staying distracted from the specific quiet that arrives when there is no performance left to give. Betty Hutton had been performing since she was 5 years old. She had been in motion her entire life. The motion was not incidental to who she was. It was the strategy that had kept her alive. And when it finally stopped, when there was no studio to conquer, no contract to leverage, no man whose position could be made useful, what remained was exactly what she had been running from since 1923. The silence of an empty house, and no one coming back. In 1967, she was fired from a low-budget Western called Red Tomahawk and replaced by another actress. Her mother died. Pete Candoli filed for divorce. The savings she had accumulated across 2 decades of the highest-paid work in American entertainment were gone, consumed by failed productions, poor financial decisions, and the compounding expense of maintaining a life built for a standing she no longer held. She attempted suicide. She suffered a nervous breakdown. She was admitted to a psychiatric facility in Rhode Island. And through all of it, her 3 daughters, who had grown up in that house, who had watched their mother operate at maximum capacity for as long as they could remember, were not present. The man who didn't know her name. Sometime in the early 1970s, Betty Hutton arrived in Rhode Island with almost nothing. She was in her early 50s. She had no stable place to sleep. She walked into a Catholic church in Portsmouth, not because she had found faith, but because the door was open and she was cold. Father Peter McGuire was a small, unremarkable man by every external measure. He had no connection to the entertainment industry. He had no idea when he looked at the tired, aging woman standing in his church that she had once been one of the most recognized faces in America. He did not offer her shelter because of who she was. He offered it because she was there, and she clearly needed it. He gave her a job, cooking, housekeeping. She took it. And then something happened that had never happened to Betty Hutton in her entire adult life. He stayed. He didn't leave when the performance was over. He didn't leave when there was nothing left to gain from her presence. He didn't leave when she was complicated or withdrawn or lost inside her own history. He stayed, year after year, for the better part of a decade, not because of what she could offer him, but simply because she was a person who needed someone to stay. She had used 4 husbands as tools to build something. Father Peter McGuire was the first person who offered her something that required no construction at all. When the press discovered where she was, and they always find out, the story moved quickly. The woman who had been one of the highest-earning stars in American cinema was washing dishes in a church rectory under a name nobody recognized. Within weeks, 35,000 letters had arrived. People who remembered her from Annie Get Your Gun, from The Miracle of Morgan's Creek, from those years when her name had been printed in every entertainment column in the country, wrote to tell her they were thinking of her. A fundraising dinner in New York raised $10,000 on her behalf. She accepted the money. She turned down every offer of a return. She walked back through the rectory door. That is the most important moment in the entire story. More important than anything that happened at Paramount, more revealing than any of the 4 marriages. Because for 50 years, Betty Hutton had organized her life around an audience, around the validation of a room full of strangers. And when 35,000 of those strangers finally showed up, offering exactly what she had structured her entire existence to receive, she chose the kitchen. She chose the cold water and the cracked hands, and the man who had never heard of her. Because he had shown her, quietly and without making anything of it, that it was possible to be present without performing, that it was possible to be cared for without having earned it first. She had never seen that before, not once in 50 years.
What Elizabeth left behind.
In 1974, at the age of 53, Betty Hutton enrolled as an undergraduate student at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island. She completed her bachelor's degree, then a master's degree. The university awarded her an honorary doctorate. She joined the faculty and taught classes in acting and singing, passing on to people young enough to be her grandchildren the technical knowledge she had accumulated over 3 decades at the center of American entertainment. The woman who had once demanded that a major Hollywood studio restructure its production schedule around her personal relationships was now standing in a classroom, trying to give her students something that had taken her 50 years to find. She appeared occasionally on television in the late 1970s and early 1980s. People who saw those appearances and had memories of the earlier work found her startling, quieter, slower, as though the voltage that had defined her had been replaced by something harder to measure. Father Peter McGuire died in July of 1996. Betty Hutton moved to Palm Springs the following year. She lived there, removed from the circles she had once dominated, until March 11, 2007, when she died of colon cancer at the age of 86. The obituaries described her as a force. They talked about Annie Get Your Gun and the miracle of Morgan's Creek and the physical energy she had brought to the American musical. They were not wrong. She had been all of those things. What most of them did not mention, the 35,000 strangers who had written letters. They had shown up. And the 3 daughters she had raised in the Beverly Hills house, the children she had treated by multiple accounts more as elements of a public image than as people with their own interior lives. They had not. That silence is the shape of the real story. Betty Hutton learned at the age of 2 that men leave. She learned it as fact, as physics, as the foundational rule of the world she had been born into. She spent the next 50 years making sure she was the one who left first, who moved first, who needed least, who never let any man have enough of her to walk away with anything essential. It worked. For a long time, it worked completely. She reached heights that very few people in the history of American entertainment have touched. And in the end, the only person who managed to stay, the only person she let stay, was a man she had never tried to use. A man who knew nothing about her career, her power, or her name. A man who simply looked at a tired woman in a cold church and decided she was worth the effort of a cup of hot food and an open door. The Blonde Blitz burned through 4 marriages, 11 years at Paramount, and every professional relationship she ever built. But the last fire she set, she aimed inward. And from what remained, Elizabeth Thornburg finally came back. A 2-year-old girl in a dark speakeasy in Battle Creek, Michigan, singing as hard as she could, hoping that this time, someone would sit down and stay.